For a long time, we have been told that history is simply what happened, that the past is a clean line of facts, names, dates, battles, kings, laws, temples, and empires. But the deeper you look, the more you realize that history is also what survived. And what survived was not always the fullest truth. It was often the truth that served the people who held power. When I say the divine feminine was erased from history, I do not mean that every culture was once perfectly balanced, or that women lived in some utopia. I mean something more specific and more haunting. I mean that across many civilizations, the sacred was once imagined in both masculine and feminine form, and that over time, the feminine face of the sacred was pushed out of the story. Not because she was weak, not because she was irrelevant, but because she represented something that could not be easily controlled. There are places in the ancient world where the evidence is not subtle, where you can feel the presence of goddesses the way you can feel sunlight in a room. Sumer, Egypt, Canaan, the Aegean, Anatolia, India. These were not fringe beliefs. Goddesses were not side characters. They were mothers of gods, rulers of the underworld, bringers of harvest, protectors of cities, guardians of birth, and embodiments of justice and power. They were adored, they were feared. They were called upon in prayer, their temples were funded, their names were carved into stone. And then something began to shift, sometimes slowly, sometimes violently, sometimes through reforms, sometimes through conquest, sometimes through the tightening grip of priesthoods and kings. The divine feminine did not disappear in one dramatic moment. She was chipped away, reinterpreted, reduced, demonized, buried. Her symbols were broken. Her names were recast as shame. Her rituals were called abomination. Her voice was replaced with rules. And this matters because a culture's image of the divine shapes how it sees the world. It shapes how it treats women, how it treats bodies, how it treats nature, how it treats power, how it treats sexuality, how it treats motherhood, how it treats emotion, and how it treats intuition. When the sacred is imagined as only masculine, the world becomes lopsided. Not automatically in every person's heart, but in the structure, in the law, in the stories that children are taught, in who is allowed to lead, in who is believed, in what is considered holy and what is considered dangerous. If you want to understand how the divine feminine was erased, you have to understand a simple truth about human beings. We do not just worship gods. We use gods to organize reality. We use gods to justify systems. We use gods to explain why the world is the way it is, and why it should stay that way. When the sacred feminine is present, she invites a different kind of order. She tends to be tied to life cycles, to the earth, to the body, to birth and death, to nourishment, to partnership, to relational power, to the home as sacred space. And in many places, that kind of sacredness belonged to the people, not just to the elite. That is one reason she became a threat. Because when spirituality lives in groves and kitchens, in the rhythms of menstruation and harvest, in the laying on of hands and whispered prayers, it cannot be monopolized in the same way. It cannot be taxed as easily. It cannot be centralized as easily. It does not belong only to a temple or to a court. It belongs to the village. It belongs to the mother. It belongs to the midwife. It belongs to the field worker. It belongs to the ordinary person who needs blessing more than doctrine. So as societies grew more hierarchical, as kings and empires expanded, as priesthoods became gatekeepers of legitimacy, the sacred began to narrow. The gods began to change. The divine feminine did not always vanish completely at first. Often she was absorbed, turned into a wife, turned into a consort, turned into an accessory. Her power was kept, but placed under male authority. The goddess becomes the bride of the god. The mother becomes the property of the father. The queen becomes the one who supports the king, not the one who rules beside him as equal. This is how erasure often works. It does not always start with destruction. It starts with reframing. You can see this pattern in places where earlier myths show powerful goddesses who later become more limited figures. You can see it when goddesses who once held sovereignty are turned into fertility symbols only, as if their purpose is to be useful rather than to be sacred. You can see it when female deities are stripped of complexity, when their rage is called hysteria, when their sexuality is called sin, when their authority is called manipulation, when their wisdom is called witchcraft. And then you can see the next stage, demonization, because once a goddess is reframed as dangerous, the culture can justify removing her. Once she is portrayed as corrupting, seducing, chaotic, rebellious, or impure, the priesthood can call her removal a moral necessity, a cleansing, a reform, a return to true faith. This is where things get brutal in the historical record. You see polemics, you see reforms, you see the smashing of images, you see the burning of sacred objects, you see laws that target women's rituals, you see stories that condemn the places where women gathered. You see spiritual power being reorganized under male control, and you also see something else. You see the body becoming suspect, because the divine feminine is often connected to embodiment, not just in the sense of sexuality, but in the sense of lived reality. Blood, milk, sweat, pregnancy, birth, healing, grief, aging, desire, intuition, emotion. The divine feminine tends to carry the truth that the sacred is not separate from life. It is within life. That holiness is not only found in rules, but in presence. That spiritual wisdom is not only achieved through abstract thought, but through the body's knowing. When that feminine sacredness is removed, the body is often treated as a problem, something to discipline, something to suppress, something to purify, a place where sin lives, a place where temptation begins. And because the female body holds such obvious power, because it bleeds and births and nourishes, it becomes an especially charged target. Women become associated with impurity, with danger, with seduction, with weakness, with temptation, with needing control. This is not an accident. This is a worldview shift. Now you might ask, did every culture go through this exact pattern? No. History is not one story, it is many stories. But there is a striking repetition across civilizations, especially as empires rise and religion becomes tightly bound to state power. The sacred feminine becomes harder to find, and where she remains, she often survives in altered form. Sometimes she survives as a saint. Sometimes she survives as a symbolic figure like wisdom. Sometimes she survives as a mother of a savior who is adored in everything but name. Sometimes she survives as the earth itself, spoken of poetically but not honored ritually. Sometimes she survives in folk practices that official religion calls superstitious. Sometimes she survives in secrecy, in kitchens, in lullabies, in herbal knowledge, in old prayers, in women's circles, in the rituals people keep doing even when they are told not to. In other words, she survives the way suppressed things always survive. Hidden, adapted, quiet, but alive. Let me talk about what this erasure does to people, because this is not just archaeology or theology. This shapes the inner world. When the sacred is only masculine, many people internalize the belief that authority is male, that leadership is male, that rationality is male, that spirit is male, that the divine speaks in command, not in nurture, that holiness looks like control, that being good means being obedient, that being spiritual means being detached from the body, that softness is weakness, that intuition is suspect, that emotion is dangerous, that sexuality must be watched, that nature must be conquered or tamed. And even if someone does not consciously believe these things, they still live in a culture shaped by them, in the laws, in the expectations, in the institutions, in the stories, in the way girls are taught to make themselves smaller, in the way women's anger is treated as ugliness, in the way women's desires are policed, in the way mothers are blamed, in the way female leadership is questioned, in the way female bodies are legislated. This is why the divine feminine matters. Not because everyone needs to worship a goddess, but because the way we imagine the sacred influences how we treat the feminine in real life. It influences whether women are treated as full human beings with spiritual authority, or as supporting characters in a story written by men. It also influences how men relate to themselves, because the feminine is not only women. The feminine is a dimension of life. It is receptivity. It is tenderness. It is the ability to feel. It is the ability to nurture. It is the ability to be present without conquering. When a culture shames the feminine, men are often taught to amputate these parts of themselves. They are taught to be hard, to dominate, to suppress tears, to suppress tenderness, to value control over connection, to fear softness, to fear vulnerability, to fear the parts of life that cannot be measured. So the erasure of the divine feminine creates an imbalance in everyone. It creates a world that worships productivity and conquest, but struggles with care. A world that builds empires, but cannot sit with grief. a world that praises strength but does not know how to be gentle, a world that claims holiness but often fears the body. And then we wonder why people feel spiritually starved. We wonder why religion feels cold to so many people. We wonder why sacred spaces feel inaccessible. We wonder why so many people walk away from faith, or why they try to rebuild spirituality in fragments. We wonder why the world feels fractured. We wonder why intimacy is confused with shame. We wonder why the earth is treated like an object instead of a living home. When the divine feminine is removed, the sacred becomes top-heavy. It becomes a head without a heart, a law without a womb, a thunder voice without a lullaby. Now, I want to be careful here. This is not an attack on masculinity. This is not a claim that male divinity is wrong. The masculine is sacred too. The problem is not the masculine. The problem is the exclusion, the imbalance, the insistence that only one face of the sacred is allowed to exist. Balance is not about replacing. It is about restoring. And the reason this conversation is rising right now is because people are hungry for wholeness. You can feel it. You can see it in the return to nature, in the growth of feminist theology, in the explosion of interest in goddesses and archetypes, in the way people are revisiting scripture and asking what was edited out, in the way people are talking about ancestral memory, lineage, body-based healing, and the spiritual wounds carried through generations. People are not only looking for facts, they are looking for what was taken from them. Because when the divine feminine is erased, something is taken, a way of relating to life, a way of relating to the earth, a way of relating to the body, a way of relating to sacred power that is not domination. You see this in how spiritual authority has been structured. For much of history, power has been positioned as something that comes from above, from heaven down to king, from king down to priest, from priest down to father, from father down to wife and child. This creates a vertical hierarchy. It creates a chain of command. It makes obedience feel holy. But the divine feminine often represents a different shape, a circle, a web, a relationship, a cycle, life feeding life, wisdom shared, nurture flowing, authority arising from care and experience, not only from position, that threatens hierarchical systems. So when you ask why she was erased, you're also asking who benefited from her erasure. The answer is uncomfortable. Centralized power benefited, patriarchal control benefited, priestly gatekeeping benefited, empires benefited, systems that needed obedience benefited, and ordinary people, especially women, paid the cost. Here is another way to think about it. In many ancient cultures, the goddess is tied to the land, to fertility, to harvest, to rain, to the tree, to the womb. When you remove the goddess from the sacred story, you make it easier to remove reverence from the land. You make it easier to treat nature as property. You make it easier to extract, to conquer, to dominate. The earth becomes a resource, not a mother. The forest becomes timber, not a temple. The river becomes a utility, not a sacred flow. You can see the consequences of this worldview everywhere now. The world is burning and flooding and cracking. The soil is exhausted. The ocean is warming. The forests are shrinking, and people feel spiritually disconnected from the living world. That is not only a scientific crisis, it is also a spiritual crisis. When the divine feminine is honored, the earth is harder to exploit without guilt. When she is erased, exploitation becomes normal. Now let me talk about the way the divine feminine returns, because she always returns. She returns first in longing. People start to feel that something is missing. They might not have words for it, but they feel it. They feel it when religion feels like rules but no tenderness. They feel it when spirituality feels like hierarchy, but no intimacy. They feel it when they are told their body is a problem. They feel it when they are told their intuition cannot be trusted. They feel it when they are told the earth is a thing to use. And longing is powerful. Longing becomes the doorway. Then she returns through symbols. Wisdom, the tree of life, the queen of heaven, the Shekinah, the virgin, the black Madonna, the feminine Holy Spirit in older traditions, the saints, the mystics, the mother archetype, the earth mother, the river goddess, the moon, the serpent as transformation, the lion as protective power. The goddess returns through art, through myth, through poetry, through dreams. People think they are just drawn to aesthetics, but often they are being pulled toward a missing piece of the sacred. She also returns through scholarship. Archaeology is unburying what was hidden. Inscriptions, figurines, sacred spaces, texts from places like Ugarit, evidence that early religious life was more complex than later tradition admitted, evidence that the sacred feminine was not fringe, she was central, and she returns through lived practice. People are planting trees, building altars at home, honoring cycles, reclaiming ritual, healing trauma through body-based spirituality, creating spaces where the feminine is not treated as secondary, where softness is honored, where grief is not rushed, where tenderness is strength, where intuition is listened to, where the earth is treated as alive. This is not a trend. This is a rebalancing, and it does not require abandoning everything you believe. That is important. Many people think the only way to honor the divine feminine is to reject monotheistic religions entirely. Some do, but many do not. Many people find ways to reclaim the feminine within their own traditions. They find it in the mystics. They find it in wisdom literature. They find it in divine compassion. They find it in mother imagery. They find it in the holiness of care. They find it in the sacredness of embodiment that was always there, just hidden. The divine feminine can be reclaimed as a way of seeing, not only as a change of deity. It is the return of balance. Now, I want to speak directly to the heart of this, because the reason people care is not academic. It is personal. When the divine feminine is erased, many women grow up feeling that their bodies are wrong, that their emotions are too much, that their anger is ugly, that their sexuality is dangerous, that their intuition is silly, that their power must be softened to be acceptable, that their role is to support, not to lead, that their spirituality is less legitimate, that their voice is less authoritative. And many men grow up feeling that tenderness is weakness, that care is less valuable than success, that emotion is shame, that being human means being hard, that the world is something to conquer, not something to belong to. Everyone loses. The return of the divine feminine is not just about goddess worship. It is about healing the split between spirit and body, healing the split between mind and heart, healing the split between humans and nature, healing the split between masculine and feminine, healing the split that tells us we must choose control over connection. Because the truth is, we are not made to be divided. We are made to be whole. And the divine, if it is truly divine, cannot be only one thing. It cannot be only law. It cannot be only thunder. It cannot be only command. It cannot be only masculine authority. It must also be womb and breath and river and compassion. It must also be gentleness and presence and nourishment and wisdom. It must also be the part of the sacred that holds you when you are broken, not only the part that judges you when you fail. This is why the story of erasure is also the story of return. Because when people begin to remember the divine feminine, they begin to remember parts of themselves, parts that were pushed into shadow, parts that were called sinful, parts that were called weak, parts that were called unimportant. They begin to honor the body again, not as an idol, but as a sacred place where life happens. They begin to honor the earth again, not as a resource, but as a living home. They begin to honor care again, not as weakness, but as spiritual power. They begin to honor women again, not as supporting characters, but as full bearers of sacred authority. And they begin to tell history differently, not as a story of only kings and wars and laws, but as a story of mothers and rituals and bodies and earth, a story of what people did at home, a story of what women carried, a story of what was whispered in kitchens, a story of what survived in symbols, a story of what was erased and why. Because that is the thing about erasure. It leaves fingerprints. If you look at a culture that is obsessed with controlling women's bodies, you are looking at a culture that fears feminine power. If you look at a religion that condemns the body while demanding obedience, you are looking at a tradition shaped by centralization and control. If you look at a history that barely mentions women except as wives and temptresses, you are looking at a story that has been curated. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. The divine feminine was erased, yes, but she was not destroyed. Because she is not only a name. She is an aspect of reality. She is the sacred dimension of life that keeps returning, because life requires her, because the earth requires her, because families require her, because healing requires her, because love requires her. And that brings me to the deepest point of all. The return of the divine feminine is not about rebellion. It is about restoration. It is about bringing back the full image of the sacred. It is about refusing to live in a spiritual world that is missing its own heart. It is about refusing to accept a history that calls half of the sacred story irrelevant. It is about refusing to be divided. If you are listening to this and you feel something stirring, that is not random. That is memory. That is longing. That is the part of you that knows that the sacred should feel like home, not like a courtroom. That knows that the body should feel like holy ground, not a source of shame. That knows that the earth should be treated like a mother, not a machine. That knows that women should be honored, not silenced. That knows that softness is not weakness. That knows that life is not meant to be boxed into rules and fear. The divine feminine was erased from history, but she left traces everywhere. In symbols, in stories, in the persistence of women's rituals, in the mystics, in the poetry, in the buried figurines, in the hidden inscriptions, in the tree of life, in the voice of wisdom crying out in the streets. And now in this time, when so many people feel disconnected, exhausted, spiritually hungry, and tired of being told to be smaller than they are, she is rising again, not as a demand, as an invitation to remember what was lost, to grieve it, to tell the truth about it, and to rebuild something more whole, to let the sacred have more than one face again, to let the divine be both strong and nurturing, both fierce and gentle, both father and mother, both law and love, both sky and soil, both the command that sets boundaries and the embrace that says you belong. And once you begin that remembering, it does not stop with the past. It changes how you live now. You start honoring your intuition. You start honoring your body. You start honoring the earth. You start honoring care. You start honoring cycles. You start honoring what you were told was less important. You start bringing sacredness back into ordinary life. And in that return, the divine feminine is no longer a forgotten chapter. She becomes a living presence, a way of seeing, a way of healing, a way of becoming whole again.